In this video, Jordan Peterson talks about the problems of being self-conscious.
So the idea there is, if you're trying to figure out how to rectify the plight of humanity, that's a good way of conceptualizing the problem. So the plight is laid out both in the story of the Buddha and in the stories that we covered last week in Genesis. It's very straightforward. People woke up and noticed that they were going to die. It's more complicated than that, but it's because it's not just death, it's vulnerability on all fronts. So you could say death, insanity, and social judgment. So death, illness, insanity, and social judgment. That's what being self-conscious means to people. And I would say the two largest class of fears go along with the mythological categories that we've been discussing, because people are most afraid of the terrible mother and the dragon, so to speak. That's chaos, that's death. And the other thing they're most afraid of is tyrannical judgment. And, those things are intertangled because, of course, if you're rejected by your culture and forced to the bottom of the hierarchy, the probability that you're going to confront a chaotic death radically increases. So, you can't really separate out rejection from chaos. But those are and you see this with people with anxiety disorders. They're almost always afraid of two categories of things. One is death and the illness, and the other is social judgment. So if you take the typical agoraphobic, because it's usually she, her biggest fear is that she's going to have a heart attack on a subway and make a fool of herself while she dies. And, because it's like the ultimate nightmare in some sense. It is in fact the ultimate nightmare. Now the problem with the story of the Buddha in part is that the ending, the enlightenment element, is vague. It isn't clear what happens there. Now, I have a suspicion that that story grew out of a far older tradition, which was the shamanic tradition. And one of the things that's characteristic of the shamanic tradition is that the shaman, usually they take some kind of psychoactive drug in the Siberia, which is where shamanism was most widely spread and most established. The drug was Amanita muscaria, which is a particular kind of mushroom. It's the red mushroom with the white caps on it, white dots on it, that you see in fairy tales all the time. And there's a reason for that. And a pole that would occupy the connection between earth and heaven was often a central feature of a shamanic ritual. And one of the things that was happening with the shaman is that when they took the psychoactive drug, they would climb the pole that represented the connection between earth and heaven, and they would go up into the domain of the gods, which is roughly equivalent to the idea of Buddha reaching nirvana. And so there's an uncharted relationship between the most archaic human religions, which were virtually undoubtedly grounded in the use of very powerful psychoactive chemicals, and the Buddhist tradition. And I think part of the reason that the vagueness is there is because the direct connection between the theological use of transformative substances and the doctrine per se is not being well specified. Now you see the same thing in South America. The drug there is usually ayahuasca, which is chemically, actually, Amanita muscaria is different chemically from ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is very much like psilocybin, and like LSD, it has the same ringed molecular structure. But of course, when the Amazonian shaman take ayahuasca, they also communicate with the ancestors and the gods. And that's a classic shamanic pathway. First communion with the ancestors, then communion with the gods. And it's actually based on the direct experience of the people who are putting themselves into this ceremony. So there's also some very interesting connections historically between Christianity and the use likely of psilocybin mushrooms. So there was a very weird book written in 1968 or thereabouts called The Magic Mushroom, The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. I think that's the name of it. Where it was a linguist who identified linguistic patterns between the theological claims of Christianity and the language used to describe mushrooms and their effect. Now that book came out sort of at the height of the hippie revolution, and even though it was a serious book, it was sort of shunted off into the hippies wrote this category, although it's not a hippie book at all. I've read it a couple of times. I have no idea what to make of the book because it's based on linguistics. It's far outside my range of of competence to evaluate, but you certainly can't brush it off lightly. And since then, there's been all sorts of evidence emerged that the use of mushrooms might have been central to early Christianity. Anyways, the fundamental split, you could say that, I think this is a reasonable way to look at it too, is that once the basic problem that faces humanity is laid out rather clearly, and so we'll say that's the problem of painful self-consciousness and knowledge of finitude, which is a major problem, right? I mean, the terror management people, the social psychologists who are terror management theorists basically say that that's rendered people permanently pathological and that they have to use illusion in order to defend themselves against that. And Freud basically made the same argument when he was criticizing classical religion. He basically said, well, people are using religious nonsense, roughly speaking, as a way of shielding themselves against their fear of death because they're too immature to be able to tolerate the reality. You know, and it's an interesting criticism, and I found it quite compelling for quite a long time. And I do think that people hide in their belief systems, but I think one of the basic shortcomings of the Freudian idea is that it doesn't really account for why people would invent the idea of hell, for example, because that doesn't really seem to be a lot more comforting than the idea of death. In fact, it's a lot worse. It's like not only do you die, but you die permanently, or you die forever, continually, in the most painful possible ways. I can't really see that as a... Like, why bother with that if it's an illusion? You could say, well, it's just to make the illusion more believable, but, you know, once you have to throw two conspiracies together to account for a phenomenon, I think the onus of proof is definitely on you.